If you're new to this channel, the social commentary of My Hero Academia is something I have regularly praised on it. Whether it be the retrospective videos or my entire videos on MHA social commentary, it did a good job injecting some much-needed nuance and depth to My Hero Academia's world. The little world-building additions of quirk discrimination, the cycle of poverty, the oversaturation of heroes, and of course, mutant discrimination, alongside so many other concepts. The important part to focus on is the word I use to describe all of this: little. It never dove too deep into these ideas, leaving viewers waiting or wondering how exactly Horikoshi might address them before the series comes to an end. Before we get into this video, there are two disclaimers I would like to make before we get too deep into the topic. One, this video is in no means a way to frame Horikoshi as a bigot of any kind. This video is a good faith critique of the contents of the chapter and genuine interpretations of the text. This video will not be a place to attack Horikoshi as a person, but we should also note that criticism is not the same as attacking. Second, this video will be referencing real-life events and real-world ideas to back up the points referenced. If real-world issues are something that make you uncomfortable or you refuse to accept any connections drawn between fiction and the real world, now is your chance to bow out. For the unaware, My Hero Academia has recently entered into its final story arc, meaning it is attempting to wrap up any and all plotlines left standing. The series is one that always waited to peel back the layers of its superhuman society, starting off portraying the status quo as, well, perfect or utopian. We view things through the lens of the protagonist, Midoriya Izuku, a bright-eyed kid who, in his own way, had suffered from the status quo, but still finds so much amazing about it. Over the course of the series, he gets exposed to more and more perspectives and life experiences, and so too does the viewer, shaping our perception of society. We are introduced to a myriad of MHA's issues, but the one we will solely be focusing on is mutant discrimination. To start, there are three primary quirk types. Emitters, which allow the user to generate and control certain things, or alter existing things in certain ways. Think of Bakugo's explosion quirk. The second type is transformation quirks, allowing the user to take on a temporary alteration of some kind, like Setsuna from Class B. The third and final type is the mutant type, also known as heteromorphic. These are quirks that cause the user to have a permanent change in appearance that sometimes is directly related to their power, such as Shoji and his multiple arms that can be turned into other body parts. The series has shown that all kinds of quirks have certain prejudices against them, like Shinso's brainwashing, but mutants get it particularly rough. It's shown at first to be name-calling mockery, like Shoji being called an octopus, Spinner being called a lizard, or the most racist character in the series, Shoto, calling this cop a mutt. But it grows into something more when we learn Spinner had initially resorted to being a shut-in to avoid the treatment he had to endure outside and feeling like he had no other option but to resort to crime, to survive in a world that outright rejects him. This is something that My Hero Academia had done well for quite some time, showing people getting stuck in the poverty trap due to feeling isolated from the people around them. MHA's strength was showing the lengths these people would go to create a society that fits them better, while also recognizing that the things they are doing are bad. The Paranormal Liberation Army was directly responsible for thousands of deaths, but you still understood their message and were eager to see how the heroes would address their legitimate complaints. Viewers had been waiting, in particular, for the mutant discrimination plotline to be addressed, and we had gotten a big dump of crumbs during the villain hunt arc. As society falls into disrepair from the previous skirmish between the villains and the heroes, citizens form their own safe houses alongside official state-sanctioned ones. People end up taking their frustrations out on the mutants, committing random acts of violence on those in the streets and quite literally denying them entrance to safe houses. And besides that, there wasn't much besides the Creature Protection Clan, a pseudo-KKK that despised those who held mutant quirks. But these two instances let us know that we were likely going to get significantly more content from the subplot going forward. When it was revealed My Hero Academia was ending in about a year, every single aspect of Hero Society that had felt undercooked but with the potential to grow, now had a timer that was ticking. And it was ticking fast. When every single plotline people were waiting for in excitement ended up being resolved in singular chapters, or sometimes even just pages, people were starting to get anxious over the nuanced messaging the series once had. We started off the final arc with Spinner being made the figurehead of the mutant rights movement, as many people have looked to him and his involvement with the League of Villains as a guiding light for the future of heteromorphs. Before this, all we had was some names, a page or two of backstory, and a discrimination group, but the scope of this plotline was about to get a whole lot bigger really fast. Chapter 370 is when the mutant discrimination chapters begin, as we get a piece of Shoji's backstory, having been called a monster, being told to stay inside, and that no matter how much society progresses, he will never be accepted. We then see Spinner, the aforementioned figurehead of the movement, having now been reduced to a blubbering giant monster, incapable of complex thought. Having the person representing the masses uprising against the state in an attempt to improve their lives be reduced to an oaf who cannot form a single coherent sentence is not a good look that already starts this plotline off to a rocky start. Of course, this is ultimately the responsibility of All For One, a terrible character I had already made an entire video video about, who is forcing himself into plotlines to suck the nuance out of them and make all of the problems fall to him. The mob has about 15,000 members, full of members of the PLF, but more importantly, ordinary citizens who sympathize with their cause. Their goal is to infiltrate a hospital in an attempt to rescue their imprisoned member, Kuragiri, who is capable of making portals to any location so that they can have the war on lock and work towards a society that accepts people of their kind. Of course, once again, you can remove the nuance of this and say that they have been manipulated by AFO to instead create his ideal society, but at the end of the day, that does not change the end goal of your average citizen. The mob advances on the police, completely trampling on them and heroes alike, as they surround the literal only black guy in the entire series, saying, "We ain't rioters. Enough out of you. Folks with human faces just don't get it." This is tone deaf for a myriad of reasons. The way the rioters are framed is something to take note of. They are drawn in an extremely ominous way, with their eyes completely whited out. This is very intentional framing in this situation, giving the reader the impression that these people are deranged or in the wrong, and making them talk down to another marginalized person. Whenever people attempt to defend this, they go down one of two dialogue trees. The first one being, quote, "The introduction of mutant-type quirks made people realize that people of other skin types aren't that different, and instead led them to directing their hatred to mutants, basically implying that as soon as quirks came around, black people stopped being oppressed." Unquote. This perspective is naive to say the least. MHA society is one that seemed to more or less follow the real world bar for bar until the introduction of quirks, and this idea that race dynamics suddenly despawned at some point is nothing substantiated by the series itself. It's an interpretation, sure, but one that lacks any backing. Secondly, this idea that bigots would replace their targets of hate as soon as a new one were to pop up is a child's level understanding of the real world. Bigots wouldn't stop hating other minority groups when the new one shows up, they would instead make room in their heart to simply hate more. The second one is, quote, "The portrayal of the mutants is intentional. Having them talk down to another marginalized person is supposed to show us just how far removed from reality they are." Unquote. This is yet another interpretation that has more or less no backing in the actual text, especially with future context in mind. Just because they are inadvertently being manipulated by All for One into achieving his goals doesn't make their rage at the system any less valid. I have a hard time not viewing this scene meta-contextually, and thinking that Horikoshi just made a hilariously tone-deaf decision to have his group, made as a stand-in for ethnic minorities, yell at an ethnic minority for not knowing what it's like to be discriminated against. The character in question could have quite literally been anybody else, and this wouldn't have been a problem, but Horikoshi had somehow managed to make it rock-lock. Immediately after this, Koda, another heteromorph student, is also knocked to the ground, as a mutant holds himself over him, stating that because he was raised in a big city, he is a race traitor. While there is definitely potential for animosity between marginalized groups for what some might not perceive as getting the real experience of oppression, or not knowing what it's like, but the way the manga frames it feels very surface level or even disingenuous. Due to the rapid pace the series has to move at, instead of delving deeper on how these people perceive each other for growing up in different environments, or accusing Koda of not knowing what their plight is really like due to being what amounts to a cop. It's instead an incredibly shallow denunciation of being a race traitor for growing up in the city. Shortly after that, we cut to the person who is really running the show here. A man who seems to have some spider-like mutant-type quirk, and his name is, Disgustus. Okay. He gives a speech about how the systems in place now are nothing but phony nonsense, referencing two demi-human mass genocide events that were literally just created during this speech with absolutely no prior reference, showing us even more that this entire thing is just an afterthought. Here, Disgustus also states that in cities, discrimination is a thing of the past. This isn't something only said by Disgustus, but is also implied by multiple other characters, giving us the impression that this is what Horikoshi truly believes has happened in cities. There is definitely no dispute here that rural areas or small towns skew more towards conservatism, which, as an ideology, often gravitates towards bigotry. Using America as a reference, as, well, I am American, you see on the election maps how large swaths of land with basically no population end up skewing red. The group in the United States that touts patriotism, law and order, border security, and the recent war on critical race theory, a problem largely invented for them to get mad at minorities, something modern American conservatives have been doing for a while, getting more and more abstract. The issue, however, comes up that Horikoshi seems to firmly believe that in the city, marginalized people deal with absolutely no discrimination. Koda was called a race traitor for it, Shoji told Tokoyami and Koda that they might not understand it, and now Disgustus, God, I cannot believe that is his name, is saying it's non-existent in the city. For those unfamiliar, I am located in quite literally the progressive capital of the United States, and boy can I assure you, there is still bigotry here. Whether it be Proud Boys marching through city streets or quite literal racially motivated terror attacks, this black and white painting of city and country life does an extreme disservice to the reality of the situation, acting extremely reductive and downplaying the real-life experiences of minorities in cities. At the time of writing, a city of 500,000 had a shooting rooted in discrimination just a couple of nights ago, and the response from conservatives with platforms or in power has been to blame the oppressed. Disgustus correctly refers to cities as a diverse melting pot, but this pot also includes those who hold disgusting viewpoints. Bigotry and racism hasn't managed to evaporate in cities. There is just a myriad of viewpoints and life experiences. This is when Shoji finally makes his debut in the mini-arc, as the talking head for the heroes, who gets on the moral high horse of questioning why they are attacking the hospital without any plan for the people inside, because last skirmish the heroes evacuated the hospital before the battle really kicked off. The first issue with this is that this is one-to-one the same exact rhetoric used against any kind of social movement in the past. And if we want one from recent times, the BLM riots of 2020. For the unfamiliar, between 2020 and 2022, the US had experienced a wave that is arguably still ongoing, of civil unrest triggered by the extrajudicial murders of black people by police. It first started in Minneapolis with the murder of George Floyd, and quickly swept the entire nation seemingly overnight, with an estimated 15 to 26 million people having participated. With any large-scale civil unrest like this, however, property was damaged. And so instead of focusing on the failings of the state, public discourse would seem to be hijacked to focus on property loss rather than the unjust loss of life. This is the exact same rhetoric being utilized by Shoji, the person, you know, representing good. I will not disagree with the fact that the act of rioting is generally bad. Destroying locally owned businesses or businesses owned by people who are also struggling is not a good thing. However, there is another perspective to look at it from. Émile Durkheim was a French sociologist active in the late 1890s and early 1900s. He proposed an idea unique to his time, stating that crime is a bundle of fundamental conditions of all social life, that crime was a useful prelude to reform. To Durkheim, crime showed the rest of society the human needs that were not being met by the status quo. Instead of writing the rioters off as being bad people or focusing purely on the property damage, the more realistic and productive approach would be to examine why the riots are taking place, to recognize it as a product of need. The racial unrest in the United States and even in My Hero Academia are the results of decades or even centuries of racial frustration, and when you have lived your life under this set of circumstances with the boot of the oppressor on your neck that they have chosen to ignore, condemning them does nothing, because optics become irrelevant after years of systemic disempowerment. This is also why I feel the idea of All for One's involvement in this plotline should largely be irrelevant. Is he manipulating them to do his bidding? Perhaps. Is he tapping into their very real struggles to get them on his side? It's likely. But even when all that is said and done, taking down All for One will never be the solution to this, because the mutants, regardless of being manipulated or not, still have the lived experiences of racist systems. This is simply the spark being lit to a powder keg that's been waiting to detonate for decades, and these experiences will not disappear. If MHA truly wanted to assign blame, it should realistically fall to everyone who is responsible for building up those social conditions, like, say, I don't know, the agents of the state that are essentially superpowered cops. According to Disgustus's randomly introduced dialogue, mass heteromorph purges are nothing new to these disenfranchised people. A common argument is that we are simply trying too hard to relate the portrayal of race dynamics and social response of MHA to real-world unrest, and that Horikoshi never intended for you to deep it that hard. The reality of fiction and all art, however, is that it all holds some meaning, whether intentional or not. What many people like myself strive to do with interpretive analysis is to make readings of the text that are based in reality. The common retort to any meaningful analysis is this dumb curtains are blue image, which, as Ocean has put it better than I ever could, the curtains can both mean anything and nothing depending on your argument, and if the basis of said argument is solid. Whether Hori intended for this reading or not is irrelevant, as authorial intent is not the be-all end-all of analysis. The fact that so many close parallels or allegories can be constructed with Horikoshi's work is the problem in and of itself, especially when we consider Rocklock's role in the plotline, as whether intentional or not, the mutants have ended up as a stand-in or a parallel to real-world ethnic minorities, and when you are a writer, you have to be responsible enough to know and acknowledge these things when making nuanced plotlines about real-world issues, especially in a story that already draws so many parallels to real-world discrimination and political topics. The second issue with this action from Shoji here is more of an in-narrative one. He attacks the movement for not having a plan for the people of the hospital, and uses the heroes evacuating the Shaku hospital to take the moral high ground over the mutants, but attentive viewers might have noticed, the heroes didn't do anything either. The heroes knew ahead of time that the hospital was a target, but never evacuated the patients. They never evacuated the doctors, And they never, at the very least, moved Kurogiri out of the hospital so the mutants wouldn't target it. Shoji is attacking the movement for doing something his group themselves neglected to do. It's not even like mass evacuation would have been an issue for them, as the entire premise of this arc was founded on them utilizing the warp quirk to mobilize the hero army in an instant. This could serve as a prime example as to why Spinner was turned into a mindless monster, because absolutely nobody could provide a retort to this paper-thin argument. The one guy who was actually guiding Spinner also conveniently doesn't address it either, as Shoji tells him he's about to set them back 30 years. What Shoji is saying is that by rising up here and resorting to violence, attacking this hospital, the optics of mutant right movements is going to be damaged, so he should stop. This is once again common rhetoric used against protesters and people fighting for civil rights. There was a line Shigaraki said in the USJ arc that, while he didn't mean because he didn't know what he was talking about, it was actually true. He calls out Hero Society for weaponizing their monopoly on violence, and he's right. The state and the state alone determines the legitimacy of force. Hero Society has investigated itself and found itself innocent when it comes to the use of violence. If you commit a crime, the heroes will come and harm you. However, when the mutants rise up against perceived harm, they are lambasted and attacked. When you are the oppressed, it is intrinsically counterintuitive to appeal to the mercy of your oppressor, because why would they just stop? Many people, including the narrative and Shoji himself, criticize what the mutants do here for being a violent protest. However, the utopian concept of a peaceful society is nothing more than naive. Human society is sustained on violence, as the very concept of the state is inherently tied to that concept, relying on it to use it for good. The only way to circumvent a system built on violence is with violence. Let's do a thought experiment here. Feel free to pause the video and try to think of a peaceful movement that has achieved something. Okay, I obviously can't read your mind as this is pre-recorded, but there's a big chance if you're a Westerner, you might have said the Civil Rights Movement or the LGBT movement. In the United States, Martin Luther King's protests were often backed up by the work of the Black Panthers, a party that at its core practiced open carry patrols designed to challenge the excessive force and misconduct of the Oakland Police Department. This intimidated the United States government, leading to the government program known as COINTELPRO illegally undermining the party by surveilling them, infiltrating them, harassing them, and even assassinating members. The Black Panthers were considered the greatest threat to the internal security of the country by J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI at the time. MLK himself had stated that the civil rights movement's threat wasn't the KKK, but the, quote, white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who constantly says, I agree with you and the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action, who opportunistically feels he can set the timetable for another man's freedom. For LGBT rights in the United States, you have events like the Stonewall riots, nationwide protests by the gay community after a police raid, as the community fought back when the police became violent. This event is considered a watershed moment that transformed the gay liberation movement in the United States. A lot of people like to say that Horikoshi is Japanese, so of course he wouldn't have the same understanding as Americans would about racism, as people in anime communities tend to paint Japan as a near utopia. However, some of these issues might hit closer to home than you might think. In 1923, Japan suffered from a massive earthquake to a region with significant Korean population, and as the local Japanese discussed the earthquake, rumors began to spread about Korean citizens literally poisoning wells, which set off a set of killings against Koreans, even coming up with codes to distinguish ethnic Koreans so that they could kill them, which also led many ethnic Chinese to be indiscriminately killed. As this is of course going to be a highly contentious video, I want to make one thing clear. This is of course not a justification or a glorification of violence. It is a rebuking of the state enacting violence unfairly to minority groups, and an understanding that in reality, these minority groups commonly fight back, which has historical precedent to be the only way they've been able to obtain rights. This is not a good thing. Of course, in an ideal world, these things wouldn't have to happen. Violence is bad, but I hope you understand why some people resort to it when their back is against the wall. While I mostly fall back on US examples, the United States is not the only nation in the world with racism, and it is not the only nation that has utilized violence to get what they want, with events like the rice riots of 1918, or the Onpo protest in the 1960s. Wow, I really got off topic, huh? The point is, Shoji rhetorically attacking the rioters for saying that this will set them back is essentially telling people with a boot on their neck to take the boot until their oppressor decides to stop oppressing you. Something that has almost no historical backing, and Horikoshi should know better even if he's not American. We then get a scene of Shoji telling the class's backstory, stating that, because he had multiple arms unlike his parents, the townsfolk came out for a blood cleansing when he touched a human child trying his best to save her life. He goes on to repeat the absolute bogus fucking claim that Koda and Tokoyami wouldn't understand what it's like to be attacked for your race because they grew up in a city. Sorry to any city people watching this video, your experiences with discrimination are invalid. I also want to point out that he only picks out Koda and Tokoyami, as if someone like Mina, or shit, even Tsuyu, would be completely unaffected by mean comments relating to their physical mutations. I'm pretty sure Bakugo says Mina has raccoon eyes at some point. It's not a huge deal, I guess, but it's just kind of funny given the rest of the state of this plotline. especially when Mineta decides to feel bad for calling Shoji an octopus but not for being a repeated sex pest. Shoji tells Spinner he too was persecuted, and that the people who did these terrible things to them weren't justified, but there has to be a better way. Not only have I already shown that no, usually there is not a better way. What Shoji is once again doing here is telling the heteromorphs to just wait for things to get better, something that clearly doesn't work in real life. Disgustus himself retorts, stating that Shoji offers no feasible solution, and that this is a pathetic cry of his own ego and referring to his idea as childish naivety. And he's fucking right? But he's drawn with his eyes bulging out of his skull and with action lines like he's wrong? He further adds that their children might be the next target due to their conduct here, but like, children already are targets. Shoji himself, as a child, was literally the target of a hate crime. And for some fucking reason, this speech full of his naivety, a lack of solutions, and forcing the oppressed to wait just works. As the other heteromorphs stop and let Spinner go alone, feeling that their anger is being used the wrong way, when in reality, this very event achieved exactly what it sought out to do. Before this heteromorph rise-up, mutant discrimination was merely a footnote in not only the eyes of the characters but even the readers, since it was merely trailed with breadcrumbs. But then they got tired of being thrust further and further into discrimination, and lashed out at the oppressor, forcing their plight into the forefront of the reader, letting us know how serious of an issue this was by hastily throwing in 2 mass anti-heteromorph events that Horikoshi spawned in and tactlessly named after Star Wars references. And now even heroes are aware of it, like this dude who is sorry for the racism. Jesus Christ, this panel sucks. This plotline sort of wraps up with Shoji telling the rioters that the feelings that made them rise up today weren't useless or wrong, which, credit where credit is due, is the first correct thing he said in the entire mini-arc. However, he has to promptly ruin this by telling them they should use their shining lights against them to shine and expose the racists in society until they feel ashamed of themselves for being cruel. This is yet another fantastically childish idea presented by Shoji and by proxy Horikoshi. It follows this phrase that some of you might not be aware of in the land of politics: sunlight is the best disinfectant. The idea that when bad ideas or ideologies are exposed and brought to light and challenged in the marketplace of ideas, if they are truly bad, then they will be forced out of the public. This also falls into the purview of the paradox of intolerance. As Karl Popper puts it, unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed. He does not simply say that the mere utterance of intolerant philosophies should be suppressed as long as they can be countered with rational argument. However, not all intolerance can be solved by rational argument. We should therefore claim, in the name of intolerance, the right not to tolerate intolerance. We should claim that any movement preaching intolerance places itself outside of law, and we should consider incitement to intolerance and persecution as criminal. In the real world, allowing people to be openly racist and hoping the exposure of that brings them down has never worked a single time. The United States is a nation very familiar with the history and atrocities of the intolerant, yet they only continue to seize power and add even more groups of people into the intolerance. When they are allowed to act out in the open like this, they are not disinfected, instead the infection spreads. In a study by Richard Rogers called Deplatforming, following extreme internet celebrities to Telegram and alternative social media, he follows highly popular cases like Alex Jones and Milo Yiannopoulos, who have been swiftly and effectively removed from the public sphere, and with that, their audience and revenue has been reduced as well as their potential reach. It also helps to demonstrate a shift in what is considered acceptable on social media, as unacceptable content and individuals are removed. It is also quite easy to claim as a privileged member of society, whether it be in real life, as people who don't suffer that same oppression, or in My Hero Academia with Shoji, who works as a weapon for the state, that people should have to just sit back and hope horribly toxic views that are centered around quite literally harming them are simply debated out of the public conscious. What you end up doing is essentially condemning the people you are seeking to protect as they face unending violence until one day, in your utopia, it magically disappears. My Hero Academia's view on racism is terribly naive and childish, which would make sense given this is coming from a 16-year-old until you realize this 16-year-old is basically just acting as a stand-in for Horikoshi's real thoughts. The last and final argument that people can use to defend this horrible, terrible, and unfortunate plotline is that it's a shonen manga, so we shouldn't expect super in-depth portrayals of real-life race dynamics, and in a lot of other series, I would probably be inclined to agree. However, just because shonen is a genre generally aimed at teenagers, and noting that Weekly Shonen Jump is actually mostly read by adults, content made for kids is not incapable of delivering bad messages. With My Hero Academia in particular, it already had that surface level but quite acceptable messaging of racism happens and that's bad. But the series itself is the one that decided to delve further into these dynamics and dip into real-life trauma with Shoji's mini-arc here. much like it did for others with the Todoroki family subplot, a plot that some people can unfortunately deeply relate to, but the plotline in particular was handled with an absolute ton of nuance and respect, never painting Endeavor as correct or his victims as wrong. Horikoshi is capable of portraying things in a nuanced manner, even if it's a shonen manga. He just didn't hear it because these are probably his real-life beliefs. Again, second disclaimer, Horikoshi is probably not a racist or a bigot. He is just extremely uneducated on these topics and should have done even the minimum amount of research required before deciding to tackle this topic in a highly popular manga series. Shoji and Koda look stupid and disgust as goat. That is all. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe for the funny YouTube algorithm. You can check the description down below to follow me on Twitter, where I'm objectively correct all the time. You can also join my Discord, where we talk about My Hero Academia, ReZero, Jujutsu Kaisen, and stuff like that. And you can also now become a YouTube member, which basically just gives you access to behind-the-scenes content, a little badge on comments, and live stream chats, and access to some emotes. Only do so if you want to support the channel, though. But that's about it, though. Thank you for watching. See ya.